All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. Today, we're kicking off what's going to be a great two-part series all about automated vehicles and focusing really on their implications on bicycling and walking, non-motorized travel. So today's session, the first part, we're going to be focusing more on the automated vehicle technologies, how these systems work, how might they be improved, and really what that means for bicycling and walking. My name is Dan Jeline. I'll be facilitating the webinar today. And what I'd like to do first is to introduce you to our great panel of speakers that we've gathered together today. First is Laura Sant. Laura is a senior research associate at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, where she leads a number of research projects related to pedestrian and bicyclist safety and mobility. Laura's the director of the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, and she's leading the development of a forthcoming paper on automated vehicles, bicyclists, and pedestrians that we'll be telling you a bit more about in a little bit. Justin Owens is also here. He's a research scientist at the Center for Vulnerable Road User Safety at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute. His research interests include pedestrian and bicycle safety, improving mobility for road users with disabilities, and human factors issues associated with distracted driving and in-vehicle device use. Justin is working with Laura and others on the forthcoming PBIC paper on automated vehicles. Bernardo Pires is a project scientist with the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. His work focuses on practical applications of computer vision, including intelligent bicycle and pedestrian counting, GPS-denied vehicle navigation, and computer vision for wearable and handheld devices. Finally, we're going to be joined by Michael Jenkins, who is a senior research scientist at Charles River Analytics. He's the principal investigator on two U.S. Department of Transportation supported efforts that are focusing on enhancing rider safety for bicyclists and motorcyclists through the application of advanced technologies, including support for connected vehicle and infrastructure networking for these vulnerable road users. We're really grateful to have such an excellent panel here today to share their experience and perspectives on this important topic. I want to spend as much time as possible on the presentations themselves, so I'll go very quickly through some background and housekeeping information. I'd like to just shift gears and ask you as the attendees, if you can hear me right now, if you can please click the hand icon that should be located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, just to let us know that everything's working, you can hear us. So I'll wait a moment as those hands hopefully start to go up and we can confirm that everyone is hearing us. Great. Okay, glad you all are here today. I think you can hear me, so we'll continue on. I'd like to let you know that if for whatever reason your computer freezes during the session, you should just be able to reload the site, log back into the program, and then join us where you left off. Note that you as attendees will not be able to speak up during the webinar, but you will have the ability to submit questions and comments to us using the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. We'd encourage you to please ask questions, submit your comments and feedback at any time. We are going to be holding about 30 minutes at the end for a facilitated discussion with all of our presenters. We've already posted the presentation slides to our archive page, which can be accessed from pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. I'm going to be sending a link out to the chat pod in just a moment with the direct location for those slides. We will also be recording this session and posting the recording to the same website. It should be available tomorrow if I can get it up in time, but definitely by the end of the week, we'll have that recording available for you. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email after the webinar ends. It's going to include a few pieces of information, including a link to sign up for part 2 of the series if you like, a certificate of attendance for you and for others. If you're attending with multiple people, you can pass the information around to them. They can also use that. And then, again, some information about where we're going to be archiving this material and where you can find it after the webinar is over. If you want to find out about more sessions that we're planning, we cover webinars on a monthly basis on a variety of topics. You can visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. Our social media, both of our handles are pedbikeinfo.org on Facebook and Twitter, a great place to catch up with us. And then even, in fact, today we're going to be talking about this webinar and live tweeting using hashtag PBIC webinar. If you want to get in on that, we'd be glad to see you there. Finally, you can sign up for our mailing list if you haven't already to get regular updates on what PBIC is working on. I mentioned that this is part of a 2-part series, so I want to encourage you, if you're not already signed up for part 2, to do that. It's going to be happening in just over 2 weeks, August 31st. And we're going to be shifting gears with this panel and speaking more about policies that can be put in place and how cities can prepare for autonomous vehicles, what they need to be thinking about. So we've got a great panel for that one as well. We'll be continuing this conversation during that session. Before we move on, I want to take a quick poll of the audience. We're always interested in finding out how many people are out there. So I'm going to launch a poll now. If you could take just a few seconds and cast your vote. We're really interested to find out, is it just you attending? Are you attending with a small group, maybe a larger group? Let us know about how many people are out there. And this really helps us understand, how people are attending our webinars, how they're digesting the information. Hopefully you are able to attend in a group or invite someone to attend with you, and you can talk about it afterward. I'm very interested in hearing about that. So I'm going to leave this open for about 10 or 15 more seconds before we move on and transition over to our first presentation. Okay, if we have any final votes to cast, please go ahead and do that. I'm going to close this poll in just a few seconds, and we'll get started. Okay, all right. I appreciate all the feedback, everybody. I'm going to close that down now and transition right over to Laura Sant, who's going to be starting off the presentations today. So, Laura, you should get the screen in just a second, and then feel free to go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, you're all set.
You can see it and hear me? Great.
Yep.
So I wanted to kick off this series to talk a little bit more first about what brings us here today and why we felt like it was important to have this webinar series on automated vehicles. If you look at the headlines today, you can see that we are in the midst of an arms race to see who can bring automated vehicles to market first. The stakes are high, and there's a lot being invested in making vehicles more automated. And the potential for profit is only one driver of this trend. If you look at the list of the potential benefits of automated vehicles, safety ranks among the top. And many people have been talking about the role of human error in vehicle-related crashes and how more automated features might be able to remove this form of error and help lead to windfall safety improvements. There's also been a lot of discussion about how automated vehicles might improve personal mobility, reduce energy consumption, and lead to more efficient roadway and land uses. And if you look at the current factors that contribute to pedestrian and bicycle crashes, you can see that pedestrians and bicyclists stand to gain from increases in automation as well. The data shown here are from a 7-year period in North Carolina looking at all pedestrian and bicycle crashes across the state and what factors contributed to those crashes. And you can see that many crashes can be attributed to driver error, such as a driver failing to see or react quickly enough to a pedestrian or bicyclist. Sometimes these crashes are accelerated by driver distraction or driver impairment. And many other crashes occur when drivers fail to yield or pass a bicyclist safely. So if new technologies can help improve driver detection and vehicle detection of pedestrians and bicyclists better and provide more predictable reactions to pedestrians and bicyclists, these could lead to very important savings in terms of life and in terms of additional comfort for pedestrians and bicyclists. But with every new technology innovation, there's always a potential for misuse or for unintended consequences. You don't have to look too far back into transportation's history to find examples of really important innovations that brought about improvements in safety and mobility and economic development, but at the same time impacted our cities and communities in negative ways that we weren't prepared to address. So as the revolution in automation continues, it's very important for us to be mindful of not only the potential benefits for different road users, but to think about some of the potential unintended consequences and how pedestrians and bicyclists may be impacted. So for example, how will the nature of roadway crashes involving pedestrians and bicyclists change as we have higher levels of automation and more driverless vehicles that are on the road? Perhaps we might see fewer human driver errors, but we might see more problems attributed to failed technology systems or glitches in vehicle programming, or perhaps the human drivers that really don't understand when and how they should be appropriately using their automated features. In the long term, we may also see people adapting to automated vehicles and changing the behaviors and the ways that they walk and bike and look for and communicate with traffic. And so that might contribute to new problems as well. So thinking about these issues now will help us to mitigate them on into the future. Another important question is how automated vehicles will impact public health. Perhaps, if you look at the data from 2015 and then think about where we will be in another 20, 30, 40 years, we might actually see improvements in safety and reductions in unintentional crashes and injuries. But if we end up seeing more people spending sedentary time in these vehicles because the vehicles are so much more attractive than walking to transit or than biking, then what other public health problems will emerge? Will we start to see a rise in heart disease stemming from obesity? And what do we need to be thinking about to balance some of these concerns? And while it's important to be asking these questions, it's also very hard for us to answer them at present time. But what we do know now is that the technology for full automation is still very limited and very much in its infancy. You can see by this table, this is a test by a German auto club of different technologies on existing vehicles. They found that most of them had a very difficult time detecting slow-moving bicyclists and pedestrians with dark clothing and in dark conditions. So some of our speakers today will talk more about detection technologies and what we need to do to be improving our capabilities in terms of detecting vulnerable road users. Something we also know now is that the automated vehicle research and development community still hasn't focused heavily on pedestrian and bicycle issues. This study came out in January from the City of London, and they looked at more than 400 articles published around the world and identified only 20 that dealt with walking and biking. And so there's a lot happening in terms of automated vehicles, but there's still not enough attention on some of the important issues that will impact pedestrians and cyclists. And of the literature that's out there, if you take a look at it, it often treats pedestrians or bicyclists in a very superficial manner, categorizing them as very similar to objects or roadside hazards that need to be avoided or moved around quickly, rather than thinking about the complexities of pedestrians and bicyclists, their human motivations, what might predict their travel, how they can interact and communicate with automated vehicles, unlike other types of roadside hazards that vehicles may need to be programmed to work around. And this is a problem because to reap the full benefits of automation, automated vehicles will need to figure out how to detect and travel safely around pedestrians and bicyclists in all situations. And people and bicycles themselves also come in all shapes and sizes. They're traveling for different purposes at different times under different conditions, and they're not always easy to predict as other vehicles that might stay in between the lane lines. So this is really a critical time and a very exciting time to be engaging in research and policy discussions. If you've attended the Transportation Research Board annual meeting or the ITE conference recently, you know that there's a lot happening around automated vehicle research and development. AASHTO has developed a research roadmap in recent years. It lays out a plan for more than $15 million in research and 23 project ideas. And some of these explicitly reference pedestrian and bicycle issues, but all of them are going to be touching on issues that are important for all road users. And so as more research is funded and policies are established, now is a really critical time for the pedestrian and bicycle community to be engaged and for all of us to be thinking about how we can harness this investment in research and development to critically move forward the safety and mobility needs of all road users, particularly pedestrians and bicyclists. So our goal with this webinar series is to bring folks together from various disciplines and have a conversation around how automated vehicles are likely to impact pedestrians and bicyclists and what we all should be doing more of to ensure that pedestrian and bicycle safety is a center and integral part of the conversations that are being had. So in this series, we're bringing together folks with really diverse backgrounds, all working in different places around automated development or automated vehicles. We're going to be hearing from folks with backgrounds in human factors, robotics, city planning, engineering, and policymaking. And we're hoping to hear from them what are the important opportunities, where is the development and the research and the technology leading us now, what are the challenges, and how can we all think more critically about the research and policy needs moving forward. And to complement these web-based discussions, PBIC will also be releasing a discussion guide. We're hoping to have it out by the end of this month, but we think it'll be an important complement to these webinars and help provide a shared vocabulary and a focus on some of the key issues that need to be discussed moving forward. And before we move to our next panelist, another thing that's very helpful is for us and the other speakers in today's panel to know how the audience members are involved with the topic at hand. So Dan, I'll turn it over to you now to do a quick poll.
Yeah, Laura, thanks for that overview. I think you raised a lot of good questions that we can be thinking about. I've got a poll open now, and we know that everyone is coming at this from a very different perspective. This group may be very different from, Laura, the group you interacted with at the Automated Vehicle Symposium, for example. So we're interested in understanding what you all are actively doing now with respect to automated connected vehicles. Are you actively involved in research and development yourself? Are you are you forming policy? Are you monitoring the topic but not really doing anything currently? Or are you kind of new to it and you don't have any current activities? So trying to get a sense of the landscape. I actually think after we close this poll, I'm going to flip this around and show it to everybody so you can see the breakdown of the group and folks are on the room. Because I think I'm seeing right now we've got a pretty good diversity of responses. So if you can spend a few more seconds voting in this poll, everybody, maybe 10 more seconds, I'll close it and we'll move on from there. Okay, let me close the poll. We've got a good amount of folks who have voted. So let me close this and I'll show you the results. So you can see, Laura, I hope you can see this too, other panelists. If you can't, about almost half of the folks in the room, 47% are monitoring and engaged in this topic, but don't have any current activities going on. 20% are actively engaged and involved in research or development. That's very interesting to me. I'd be interested in the comments if you would send us messages to tell us more about what you're doing. And then 19% have no current activities. You're new to the topic. I hope this series can be a primer for you on some of the terminology. Some of you, 12%, are actively developing policy, and just a handful don't really know where things stand. So, Laura, I don't know if you have any immediate reaction to some of these responses.
No, I think that's great. And just to add to that, what we're hoping to do is that this is just the first parts in a series. And as we learn more about what folks are doing, what new innovations are coming forth, what new challenges need to be talked about, we plan to continue additional webinars in this series. And we're also trying to carry forward these conversations at other venues, like Dan mentioned, the Automated Vehicle Symposium, TRB, and other areas. So we're trying to stay heavily coordinated with other groups on this topic. And as we hear more from you, we will help identify other opportunities.
Great. Thanks, Laura. And what I'll do is hide the poll now. Continue, please, submitting your comments and your questions as we move through the presentations. I'm going to move things right along, though, and turn things over to Justin Owens, who's going to continue our presentation. So, Justin, take a look and see if you see the screen control come across. You should be able to go forward with your presentation from there.
Okay, let's give it a shot, and I apologize that we won't be able to step through some of the animations, but that's all right. We'll talk through them. Okay, so anyways, as I was saying, I think this is really important, and I'm happy to be a part of it, animations or no. So I think that it's very important to get the conversation started and keep it going among lots of different stakeholders. So I'm really excited to see what a broad range of folks we have on the call here today. So I'm going to be talking about some of the human factors as well as technical challenges behind the interplay between AVs and vulnerable road users. My background is in human factors psychology, and as Dan said, I work here at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, where I've been for coming up on 9 years now. Next slide, Dan. All right, so I think a very good way to start off is to arrive at sort of a common understanding, common definition of what we mean by automated vehicles and automated vehicle systems. For a lot of folks, and a lot of times the way the media portrays it, it's sort of this immediate shift over to what we think of as the cars that can drive themselves, the cars of the future. But in reality, there are 6 levels of automated vehicles defined by NHTSA and SAE. And all of those have different, both levels of automation, but also different responsibilities that are placed upon the driver. And I'll come back to this point in a couple of slides, but I think it's really important to remember that for the near future, for the next couple of decades, we're going to have a very mixed fleet on the roadway that is going to encompass some or all of these different levels of automation. So we'll go through these right now. Go ahead, Dan. Okay, so when we think of level 0 and level 1 automation, this is basically what we have on the roadways right now. The majority of vehicles are either level 0, where there's no automation at all. Level 1 we can think of as very, very basic assistance with certain tasks like cruise control. But for cars with no or very, very basic automation, the driver's responsibility is that of active control. This is how we all grew up driving. This is what we think of currently as driving. That we are controlling all or almost all of the vehicle's functions at all times, and at all times are responsible for the safe movement of that vehicle. Next, Dan. So when we move up to level 2 and level 3 automation, what we think of as partial or conditional automation, these are automated vehicle systems where the system can take over some aspects of the driving task some of the time, but is not able to fully drive without human intervention at all times or in all situations. So for example, the Tesla autopilot that most of you are probably familiar with is a level 2 system, which means that under certain conditions, usually on the highway, it can either control steering behavior and or speed/longitudinal control behavior, but the person behind the wheel has to be responsible for monitoring the environment and potentially taking back over control of the vehicle at any moment if the vehicle begins behaving unexpectedly or if it gets into a situation that it's not designed to handle. Level 3 is more automated yet, but there are still likely to be conditions that a level 3 system cannot handle, and it will still have to hand control back over to the driver, albeit with a little bit more notice than a level 2 system. But the driver still, for example, can't be taking a nap or be entirely zoned out from the driving situation. So they're still responsible for being aware of and monitoring the driving environment. Next, Dan. So finally, we get to level 4 and level 5, which we can think of as highly or fully automated systems. And these systems are what we can often think of as the full self-driving cars. So for level 4, they're self-driving within a very limited, perhaps geofence zone. So we can think of this as perhaps a bus on a very limited route. Whereas level 5, we can think of as a vehicle that is fully self-driving, a full autonomous car that can take you to grandma's house and back over any roadways you can think of. And so for level 4 and level 5, this is what people often think of with autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles. And in these cases, the person who used to be the driver really is now a passive occupant, but does not have any expectation of responsibility for exerting control over the vehicle or for maintaining monitoring of the environment. So again, I'll come back to this in a couple of slides, but it's really important to keep in mind through all of these presentations and anytime that we hear and talk about automated vehicle systems, that for the next at least 3 or 4 decades, it's going to be a mix of all of these levels of automation on the roadway. It's not going to be an immediate shift over to full self-driving cars. I'll get off my soapbox now. Great. So from a positive perspective, we can think of a lot of potential safety benefits for vulnerable road users, such as pedestrians and cyclists, with the advent of full automation, but also with partial automation. So as Laura said, we can imagine that there could be improved perception compared to human drivers. Go ahead, Dan, next. So the improved perception, the ability to detect vulnerable road users in the world, particularly possibly at night, depending on what systems are being used. Go ahead, Dan. Or potentially even with occlusion. So by that I mean cases where somebody may be about to emerge from behind a parked car. So these are cases, bad environment or occlusion, nighttime, where it is particularly difficult for the human perceptual system to be able to detect and identify vulnerable road users out in the environment. And this is an area that's very difficult from a technical perspective, but has the potential for great improvement with automation and connectivity. Go ahead, Dan. Also, automated vehicle systems aren't likely to suffer from distraction, fatigue, emotions like anger or sleepiness or sadness. So in this case, they may be able to perform better over long periods of time or in challenging situations than human drivers can. Go ahead, Dan. They're likely to have faster reaction time. They don't have the human perception response system, the time that it takes a human to see, identify, predict, and react to an adverse event in the environment or to a pedestrian is likely to be significantly shorter with computer technology. Go ahead, Dan. There are likely to be improvements in efficiency, both on roadways in general, but also from a pedestrian and bicycle specific perspective. We can think about improvements in the efficiency of flow at intersections. We can even think about potential intersections of the future that may not have stoplight control, that pedestrians would not have to wait through several light cycles to cross, that they may be more reactive to pedestrian needs. Go ahead. Go ahead, Dan. And finally, we can imagine that there will be significant improvements in affordances for pedestrians with disabilities as well as senior people. So pedestrians on the roadway who need added consideration for their mobility needs, and also the larger group of people with disabilities as a whole. The advent of automation may improve their mobility as a group, and this is a very important thing for people with disability community. Next slide. Okay, and this is one where I'm not sure if the animation is going to work, but it was this was designed to illustrate sort of an optimal current case scenario where we can imagine that the interplay between a driver-controlled vehicle and pedestrians on a roadway right now is a very social interaction. Oh, it works. So this is obviously a little bit cute and a little bit idealized, but you can imagine that at least in a lot of cases where pedestrians and drivers interact on the roadway, there's two-way communication here. So the driver may look, see a pedestrian, give a little wave and a nod and say, go right on ahead, it's your turn. The pedestrian may return that wave. And there's this communication that facilitates the safe movement of pedestrians and drivers. Next slide. In fact, this is the basis of a lot of public safety campaigns. You can just tab through these, Dan. Things like, these are just examples that I picked off the web from all around the country, but making eye contact between drivers and pedestrians. These sort of scary ones are the tire tread across the face, make eye contact, not body contact. Make sure drivers see you, make sure you see the driver. List of things here to do, wait for traffic, make eye contact, so on and so forth. So this is sort of a fundamental way of interacting that's critically important right now to how people move safely through cities and country and beyond. Now, if we think about a highly automated future, and again, here we're really jumping to level 4, level 5 automation, but this particular point holds true when we're not really clear about what level of automation a vehicle is under as well. Go ahead. We can see that as the vehicle and the pedestrians approach the intersection, it now moves from a bidirectional human communication to sort of a unidirectional human-machine interface problem now of both the vehicle and the pedestrians trying to understand the intentions of the other. And I'll come back to this in a couple of slides too. So let's move along. So coming back to this point about the penetration rate over time, these data are purely hypothetical, which means that I just sort of made them up. But the point of this slide is to show that this really isn't going to be an overnight transition to full automation of level 4, level 5. For the next several decades, a large proportion of the vehicles on the roadway are either going to be controlled by humans all the time or, potentially concerningly, going to be controlled by humans some of the time. So for decades to come, we're going to have a mixed fleet, whichever way these curves end up moving. Go ahead. So what I'd like to do for the next couple of slides is talk about a few of the challenges for automated vehicle and pedestrian bicycle interactions. I'm going to be talking through some images that are taken from the draft paper that Laura Sant and I are working on. And I'd like to thank Graham Russell at PBIC for putting these images together. Go ahead. So I'm going to be talking through some technical issues, some social issues. Most of these are both technical and social issues. Go ahead. And most of these apply to all levels of AVS control, of automated vehicle system control, to some degree or the next. And some of them are going to apply in different ways to different levels of control. So go ahead. In particular, for a lot of these, I want to think through, and I want us to think through the real challenge with mid-level automation of when and how do we demand that the operator, the driver, take control of the vehicle, and how does that get communicated to people on the outside, who or what is controlling the vehicle at any moment. So let's go ahead, Dan. So the first thing I want to talk about is the detection problem. How is it that an automated vehicle system is able to detect a vulnerable road user? So here in this image, you can see somebody who's actively crossing the roadway. There's a bicyclist up ahead, and there's a pedestrian on the right. Go ahead, Dan. So there are challenges inherent in this depending on what technology is being used. There are a lot of technologies that are currently being developed for this. There are things like machine vision, which obviously works better in the daytime. Systems like LiDAR or infrared. There are different ways of using vehicle sensors to see what is out in the world. And trying to find what's out there and what those things out in the world are is a major technological challenge. And all of these different systems are all have certain limitations. They're all being worked on and developed, so they're all sort of currently in development stage. So related to that, so not only that, how can automated vehicles parse and track crowds? So here we just have 3 people that it needs to pick up and identify, but you can imagine a busy intersection may have 5, dozens, hundreds of people that the AV needs to be able to pick up on at least the most behaviorally relevant of these. Go ahead, Dan. Related to this, there's a lot of discussion about connected vehicles, which is using technology like dynamic short-range communication, or in some cases Bluetooth, to use wireless communication to be able to detect other road users, sometimes pedestrian cyclists, sometimes other drivers, sometimes motorcyclists, things like that, to be able to detect both their position as well as their movement without reliance on things like machine vision. However, there are drawbacks to this technology. Go ahead, Nan. Some of these challenges include technical limitations like battery drain. What happens if someone's system runs out of batteries? So for pedestrians, I should add, what's being talked about here is carrying around beacons, perhaps in a smartphone or some sort of separate device that can enable wireless communication with the vehicle. So there are cases of battery drain. All of us have experienced our smartphones dying before the end of the day under heavy use. Device failure if the beacon just ceases to function properly. There are human factors and human privacy consideration. Things like, go ahead, Dan, if humans will want to carry around devices that enable their detection at all times. Things like forgetfulness if they forget to bring their pedestrian sensor along, or simple choice if they choose to use or not use one of these systems. So the connected technology has a lot of potential, and there's a lot of discussion going around it. But we have to keep in mind that there are a lot of human-centric issues surrounding this as well. Right, next slide. Coming back to the prediction of intent, if we are able to detect pedestrians and cyclists out in the world, what do we do next? We have to be able to predict what pedestrians are going to move when and where. So how does an automated vehicle system determine, for example, whether that pedestrian standing on the side of the road there is going to step out into the roadway, or if they're just sort of hanging out waiting for a bus or hanging out waiting for a friend to meet them? This is something that currently is a very social thing. It's relatively trivial for drivers to detect via body language if a pedestrian or pedestrians are about to step out in the roadway or waiting to cross, or if they're just standing there chatting. The flip side of that is for pedestrians and cyclists to be able to determine what the vehicle is going to do. So again, this takes what used to be a fundamentally social process and moves it into a human-machine interface process of trying to determine intent from a vehicle that no longer has the social capabilities that we're used to. This is particularly this is a particular challenge when we think about mid-level automation, where it may or may not be clear to other road users whether a vehicle is currently being controlled by the person behind the wheel, in which case they would want to make eye contact with that person, or if that person is just along for the ride and the vehicle itself is making the control decisions. Go ahead, Dan. In a mixed fleet, like I just said. Go ahead. It's also important to keep in mind cultural norms and differences. I've lived in a number of areas of the country, and the cultural distinctions for pedestrian right-of-way up and down even just the eastern seaboard are very, very different. So I lived in Providence for a number of years, and there, if you showed any inclination of wanting to cross even in the middle of the block, a driver would stop and you would be able to just walk across the street. Now, we could argue whether or not that's a good thing, but that's the driving culture in that place, and there are a wide variety of driving cultures both within the United States and, of course, around the world. So trying to incorporate local cultures and norms into this prediction of intent and communication is a real challenge. We also have to think about people who may be less predictable and smaller, such as children, or people who have special needs, such as people with disabilities, and what particular affordances we can consider for them. Go ahead, Dan. Relatedly, trying to determine the right of way in a given situation is a very social and cultural issue, as well as obviously being a legal issue. And of course, in some cases, the legalities do not necessarily mesh up with the prevailing culture or social mores and norms. Go ahead. Keep going, Dan, sorry. So there's a conversation that needs to be had here when we consider all these different driving environments. To what extent we want to replace personal communication? Is that possible? Should we be replicating this type of interpersonal communication? What types of interfaces can be developed and designed? How can they best be tested? And what's the best and most scientifically correct way to shift from this current social communication to a user-machine interface type of paradigm? Go ahead, Dan. Next, and I think this is the last one, thinking about when we come up behind bicyclists right now as drivers, there's very often a decision made based on the driving environment and based on the exact position of that cyclist, whether we're going to try to pass that cyclist or whether we're going to hang back and wait for a more opportune time. And this is something that really hasn't been talked about a whole lot in the development of AVs in the public steering ways. This is a very important question. How does an automated vehicle system determine when to pass a cyclist pedestrian? Go ahead, Dan. And when they do, or when do they hang back and wait for a better time to do that? Next. Related to this, when an automated vehicle or a vehicle with an automated system decides to pass a bicyclist or a pedestrian, how does it weigh giving passing distance versus crossing the lane line, which technically would be a violation of law? So we'll come back to this in a slide or two as well. Under what circumstances are vehicles allowed to break laws? Go ahead. So I'm running sort of short on time here. In fact, I may be beyond my time, but I just really wanted to touch pretty quickly on a few legal and ethical questions that apply to the overall domain of automated vehicle system, but also in particular the play between AVs and pedestrians and bicyclists. So first of all, the trolley problem has gotten a lot of press. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it, but it comes back to the fundamental question of if an automated vehicle system is placed in a situation where either the occupant of the vehicle is going to be harmed or someone or some group of people outside the vehicle is going to be harmed, how does it make that decision? That's currently something that is a very, very human decision that thankfully we don't have to make very often, but does have to be made on occasion. So it's an edge case, but it's a very important edge case that we need to think through. It goes back to the programming of morality. Go ahead. Under what circumstances can automated vehicle systems break the law? So in other words, you go ahead, Dan, to the next thing. But under what circumstances do we allow them to break minor laws or major laws? So for example, a minor law may be crossing over the center line, or that may be major in some circumstances to allow safe passage of a bicyclist or pedestrian or a broken down vehicle in the lane. What about speeding, for example? Should automated vehicles be allowed to travel with the flow of traffic, even if that, as usual, violates the speed limit? Next. Who's liable in cases where there is a collision? That is especially thorny when we think about mid-level automation, where the control of the vehicle may be either given to the driver or the vehicle itself, depending on the situation. What limitations are there on the operational domain? By which I mean, especially again in cases of mid-level automation, should there be limitations on when an AV system is allowed to control the vehicle? So currently, certain level 2 systems that are out there are designed to only work on the highway, but to greater or lesser extents, they can work in towns and in cities. So what types of regulations and restrictions do we put on systems that may or may not be capable in the near future of dealing with pedestrians and cyclists and children and other vulnerable road users? Go ahead. Okay, so we'll see if this video works. I'm not sure if it translates over, but I just wanted to really quickly show you that something that we're working on here at VTTI. This is oh good, it is working. little bit choppy. It looks a little better than this in real life. But this is a virtual reality pedestrian simulator that we're working on developing here, and it really is quite a bit smoother in real life. But what this allows us to do is to develop different types of situations that we can put people in fully immersively, where they can look around and walk around, and allows us to really look at different combinations of environmental factors, roadway factors, and driver or automated vehicle factors to try to investigate the world of human factors related questions that we've talked about here and that we'll continue to talk about for the next hour or so that I think is really important. Go ahead. And okay, so just to summarize, I want to bring this back to a call for human factors psychology research, a little self-serving, but I think that this is extremely important. So even or especially with automation, there are a lot of outstanding questions about the interaction between humans and machines. This is the fundamental core of human factors research, is trying to improve relations between humans and computers and machines. So hey, how can we bring this expertise, this research expertise, and lines of research into this very fast-moving field of automated vehicle system development? Next. There are, of course, opportunities for improvements over current human perception, especially in cases where humans are particularly fallible, such as cases with limited visibility and performance. But however, one more Dan. There are a lot of outstanding issues that we just went over, and the next few presenters will talk through about all sorts of issues surrounding VRUs and AV interactions, detection, prediction of intent, and interaction, all of which come back to fundamental interactions between human and machine. So I believe I will leave it there. I think that Dan said we'll leave questions for the end, so feel free to submit those or write them down.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. I appreciate it, and appreciate you helping push through those technology issues there. We figured it out.
No problem. That's plenty ironic.
Yeah. Bernardo, we're going to send things your way, so if you take a look at the screen and let me know, we'll let you know when we can see yours. I see it now. If you go to full screen mode, we should see it fully.
Great. So, hi everyone. So I guess you can confirm, Dan, that you can all see my screen now. Is it full? I'm trying to get okay, full screen mode now.
There we go. We got it.
Okay. Okay, great. So hello everyone. So my name is Bernardo Pires. I work at CMU Carnegie Mellon University. I'm a project scientist here. I just want to give a brief mention to our University Transportation Center here, who's been funding and supporting a lot of this work, particularly the Technologies for Safe and Efficient Transportation, and also the Traffic 21 Research Institute here at CMU, dedicated to traffic issues. So I'm going to give you somewhat of a different overview and talking about I guess different point of view to look at some of the issues in autonomous vehicles. A brief background, I'm working more on the perception side. So on the details about how to detect pedestrians, how to detect bikes. In particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about my work that we've done that is tailored towards not vehicle use, but infrastructure studies where we count pedestrians and we count bikes and we try and track them and find out origin and destination. And I just want to give a brief mention that this is work that includes, of course, the numbers collaborators. And so you got Mehmet, Chris, John, and Jung in particular were fundamental to get this work done. Some of the research mentioned is already been published also. And if you want, you can ask in the questions, or you can look up on the information for the webinar, my contact, and you can get in touch if anyone is interested in more details. So anyway, here's a brief summary of a few points that I wanted to get across during my presentation. So the first point, I think, is that from my perspective, where do we stand now, and what's keeping us, or what's the main roadblock to getting higher and higher levels of autonomy? And my argument, I think a lot of people in the industry would agree, is that situational awareness is the key for the autonomous vehicles. And situational awareness means the car being able to find out where it is and find out what are the users, the road users around it. This is the key challenge. So it's essentially the key challenge right now appears to be not on, for example, the mechanics of the car or how to actuate the car, but it's mostly on how to get the car to perceive the world accurately at the level that approaches a human. So when a human is in the driver's seat and he looks around, the human very quickly is aware of what's going on. Getting the car, the autonomous vehicle, to that point is where we stand right now. Then I want to give you brief examples of the work we've been doing in bike and pedestrian detection. Then also what, finding, so if situational awareness is the key, then how do we achieve situational awareness? And I want to make an argument that the autonomy and the situational awareness is becoming a data race, in the sense that the particular limitations of what we have to get in order to get more and more autonomy seems to be that we need more and better data. And what does that mean for policy? So policy implications, and how can also for the attendees that are more tied to infrastructure decisions, how can we help, how can infrastructure support the autonomous vehicles? So that's a brief summary. So for a quick overview, if you just think very, very, very high level, how any autonomous vehicle is going to work. Right now, the current, level 0 and 1 level 1 autonomy systems we have, and moving up and up in autonomy, there's really, 3 cores. You have a sensor suite where you can have cameras, visible or infrared cameras. You have radar, LiDAR. You have ultrasonic sensors for short distances, and of course you have the GPS software. And so that sensor suite is going to inform the autonomy software. And what are the main tasks that the software has to do? First, it has to estimate the state. So find out where it is, the location where it's at, and what I was referring as situational awareness. Find out from the perspective of the car, find out not only where the car is, but also what's around it. And then also has to plan the path. So short-term path thinking means, am I moving forward and at what speed? And long-term, you can have an overall route of what's the route that the car intends to make to reach its destination, and how the short-term can take us to the long-term. Finally, the software, once it makes decisions, has to actuate. So meaning send out driving commands, steering angle, acceleration, braking. And of course, we also should include that we also, hopefully the autonomy software will also be able to act in as an emergency. So for example, we have systems right now that can do, for example, cruise control, but at the same time can also be used to detect when we're in a situation where it's a dangerous situation and you want to have auto braking coming on. So again, situational awareness is a key challenge. So from a technical perspective, I think the industry is converging on this, insight that this is all the autonomy is going to really hinge on on being able to determine what is around the car, and maybe making the car smart enough to figure out what's around it, just based on this limited sensor suite. So that's the first point I wanted to make. So now when you think about situational awareness, we can think about how as we increase the autonomy, we can go from simpler tasks that we can already find in many of the cars driven on the road right now. So for example, lane keeping, or adaptive cruise control. So for example, these are 2 good examples, because a lot of the cars, especially if you buy newer cars, more high-end cars, but it's trickling down towards kind of all price ranges. A lot of them already have the ability to, especially in the highway, just follow the lane. So you set it and the car can, as long as you're on the highway and there's good weather conditions, the car should be able to follow its own lane and should be able to detect if you have, cars in front of you slow down, for example. So we can think of these as technologies that, for example, for a human can kind of understand what's going on. You can kind of formulate these as rules. So for example, that if you want to have a lane keeping autonomous vehicle, you just tell it, look for the high contrast markings on the road and follow those markings along. You should have a marking on your left and a marking on your right. Just follow those along, and as long as there's markings and the road is clear and there's good weather and good visibility, the car should be able to just follow that along. But as we want to have more and more autonomy, these rules become harder and harder to define. You can think of road sign interpretation, where the car is just looking out for what's the road signs. For example, speed limits, stop signs, yield signs. And you can think of it still, okay, I can have a rule for this. I just have a database in the car with all the different signs that the car can see. And all that the software has to do is just look at the sign and look at its database and see, okay, what matches. Interestingly, I don't know if you're aware, but there's been very recent research saying that if you stick stickers on signs for certain types of software, autonomous software right now on the road, it will be enough to confuse things that would probably not confuse a human. And so that's an interesting point where the technology is at and how we can do, what we need to do and how, more we still have to go until we can get, full autonomy. Anyway, let's get this to more of the practical, let's have the car drive itself problems. When you want to have a car drive itself, then it starts to become necessary to detect infrastructure. What are the viable paths? Is there a lane merge, a lane split? Am I approaching intersection? And how is this being handled right now from a research perspective or in the industry? Right now, there's no easy rule to just go, for example, from an image to, okay, here's what the infrastructure looks like. And often we're using maps to assist the car. But this means that it's going to be pretty hard for a car to make decisions in terms of what's the infrastructure around it when the reality diverges from the map that it expects to see. So, a lot of, you'll see, and this comes out in the news every so often, that one of the things that really trips up, if I can use that expression, trips up the cars as they're trying to, self-driving cars, is any type of construction work. Why? Because what the car expects to see and what it finds on its map or its database is not matching what's there on the reality. And that sometimes is enough to confuse a car. But of course, as humans, we know that that does not confuse a human. A human can drive through construction work all the time, follow the directions, be a little bit more careful. However, the cars right now are not there. And if I go to even more increased autonomy, then we really need to be aware of all the road users, including pedestrians and cyclists. And there's really clearly no easy rule. The pedestrians and cyclists are really hard to track and hard to detect. I believe I have a slide. Okay, so actually before I go there, why they're hard to track and detect. So I just wanted to make this point that if I can say so, our current technology handles, well, maybe the top 3 examples that I have here. We still have trouble on the bottom 2. And this is going to be something that, the industry and the research community is going to still have a good amount of work to do. But we're aware of it. And even coming back to a point that Laura made earlier, keep in mind that maybe might not be a lot of publications, but that does not mean that there's not a lot of interest. It just means that the problem can be pretty hard. And also that sometimes you have industry players that are working on this and that are not really motivated to publish what they're finding. This sometimes happens when a field becomes very relevant to industry, and when there's a race where there could be a significant amount of monetary success for the companies that get this working, they might not be interested in sharing what they find. So not having research papers out there does not mean that this research is not occurring. Just keep that in mind. So what was the big difference between these top three technologies and the bottom 2? Well, a main key difference is that the rule-based solutions start to break down. Whereas you could have a rule for following lane keeping that just says look at markings on the road, there's no preset rule that you can have to detect a pedestrian, because especially a pedestrian or a bicyclist, their shape can change so much and their appearance can change so much that it's not possible to have a single rule that will make a car detect a pedestrian. And the same thing for the infrastructure, of course, when it changes. Less often, but still a problem. So this means that we need more complex perception models. So if we have, from a perception point of view, if we're trying to make the car aware of the pedestrians and make the car be able to perceive what's going on, simple rule-based models will not work. We need something that's a little bit more powerful, a little bit more complex. And so what is currently the dominant technology that's driving the car automation forwards is really machine learning. So machine learning, in a nutshell, if there's anything you can take away from this, is just how does it work. It really doesn't matter how the specific details work. In a nutshell, machine learning it just learns from examples. So if you want to have a computer detect a pedestrian, just show the computer millions and millions and millions of images or sensor returns from a pedestrian and have the computer learn by example. This loosely, kind of in a very loose way, mimics the way humans learn also. We all learn by examples. A big difference is that humans are much better at generalizing what they learn than computers are at this point in time. And then it has, of course, like every tool, has positives and negatives. A big positive is that a system based on machine learning is, right now, they're state of the art. They're the best ways to solve a lot of these problems, in particular in computer vision or in machine vision. But the drawback is that they become more and more like black boxes. So since the system is not really following a specific rule, it's much harder to evaluate how well it does. And also because it's based on examples, it's much harder to assure that the computer has seen all the examples out there and has seen all the possible ways in which a human can look, or enough examples that it can generalize how the human can look or can appear to the car. So this is a positive and the negative. Why are pedestrians and cyclists such a hard problem? Again, there's two things. They vary, their shape, their appearance varies the most. Also, they're the smallest in terms of size compared to the cars or any bigger truck. And that means being small means that they're going to have less returns in terms of any LiDAR system that will require an active output light source that hits the target and comes back. Being smaller is worse because you have less returns. For the cameras, you need higher resolution because it's hard. By being smaller, it's harder to see the details in the pedestrians and the cyclists. And also the big problem is that humans can wear all kinds of things. The human body is flexible, can change shapes, and those are all tricky things for a computer to learn. Then also the other part of it is that it's harder to predict motion. So the pedestrian, you can have pedestrians unexpectedly cross the road, jump onto traffic. And that's very tricky for a computer to predict, just based on how they sometimes the pedestrian is walking on the side of the road and there's very, very little indication that it's going to step on the road, especially if you think that the computer has relatively low resolution, so it might miss some small cues that a human might be able to pick up. For the cyclist, a lot of the problems are related also with movement within the lane. So since a bicyclist is relatively smaller than the lane, it can shift from being in the middle of the lane to being more on the right side when it's expecting the car to pass, to being more on the left side if it wants a left turn. And so those can be tricky on the car, on the autonomous software. And then also, of course, they're the most exposed or fragile road users, so that just makes everything even harder. Because it's really the case where a mistake is not a fender bender, a mistake is really someone going to the hospital. And so this is the main problem. I just have a brief overview now of some of the work we did. I'm calling it the intelligent mobility meter. We just put hardware and software to record bikes and pedestrians. We did it to tackle a specific problem here in the city of Pittsburgh, where we wanted to estimate the usage of dedicated bike lanes, and the other problem where we wanted to evaluate the impact of adaptive traffic lights on pedestrian wait times. And so this is just a system. This is an example of what the system collected, of all the videos that we collected. And I just have it here to give you an example of what was necessary to create a system that tracked pedestrians and tracked bicycles. In this case, we actually had to label, meaning create examples for the computer, about 10 hours. And if you think of it, we had 1 million frames, so 1 million different images that were hand annotated, so that we could have enough examples for our computer system to learn to recognize pedestrians and cyclists. And this is a very small project. So just think of the scale of what we have to have autonomous vehicles. You know, many times the scale of data that we had for this project. So this is an overview of how it works. It's very high level. We have a bike or pedestrian classifier that just finds road users in general, both bikes and pedestrians, and then we have a classification step where we distinguish bikes from pedestrians. And finally, just a brief video of some results that we got. Dan, can you just confirm that this video is coming through?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, it is coming through.
Yes. Okay. Great. So this is just gives you an example of our system tracking bikes, tracking pedestrians, and this is actually being used to count bikes and pedestrians crossing this red line here. I'll just play it back from the beginning because this part is more interesting. And this is the same type of thing that you want to see, for example, if a car camera needs to be doing in real time, at least for the ones that are close by. As pedestrians are close to the car, you need to track them and you need to try and figure out where they're coming from and where they're going. So given this example of bikes and pedestrians classification, detection, and tracking, this gives you a little bit of a flavor. So oh, by the way, our overall accuracy for our system was 95%, which is pretty good for a counter. So then let me give you a little bit more insight on why I think that, you know, the race to autonomy is actually becoming a race to data sets or more data. So oftentimes, when you think about the system, for example, the system that we use to learn where are the bikes, where are the pedestrians, and count them, this is, like I said, a machine learning system. So its performance, its success rate is going to depend largely on the quantity and quality of data. That's why we had to have 1 million images to train it. Now, if that's the primary driver, then it means that you have numerous startups and even established manufacturers all vying to collect data sets big enough to be able to train their machine learning systems, to be able to find pedestrians, to be able to perceive the world. And just to give you a particular example that I think is particularly relevant for this conversation is Tesla is actually having its customers that drive the Tesla cars send back the data to Tesla headquarters. And so, for example, on May 2016, so more than a year ago, Tesla already had 780 million miles of data. So this was data that was, this was millions of miles that were driven where the sensors capture the data, and we also have the commands that the driver gives to the car. So this was not self-driven. This is just the database that can be used to learn how to drive. And Tesla was collecting data at a rate of 1 million miles every 10 hours. So this is a really large scale. But it is my opinion as a researcher that this is really where we're going to converge towards this, this race to get more and more data that's going to train more and more complex algorithms to approach the proficiency of the humans in perceiving and in driving. So what are the, okay, you can see, okay, this makes sense, but how does this impact all of us, and how does this impact policymakers? So I think the most obvious is in terms of consumer privacy and education. Number one, we need to make sure that these data sets that are being used respect the privacy of the consumers that share them, and also that the consumers are aware that they're sharing this data. So, for example, right now for the Tesla, there's a software update, and the software just asks the user, I'm going to collect the data and send it back to Tesla, and asks if the user is okay. And most users will say, sure, yes. But are the people that are saying yes to this really aware of how it's being used, how valuable it is, and how, you know, it can at some point be leaked in the future, and, you know, that it might be something there that they might not like to have made public, because, you know, once it's sent back, it becomes the property of a company, and so some people may or may not be happy about that. The second point I wanted to make, and I think this is very, very relevant for policymakers, is the data sharing. So as soon as we say, okay, this data is going to be used to train our system, and it's going to be used to make our system as powerful as possible in finding humans and finding pedestrians and finding cyclists and being able to avoid them, then shouldn't this data be shared? Shouldn't it be shared with the government? Should it be shared with academia, with research organizations? And shouldn't even be shared between manufacturers? Because in a way, this is safety data, right? So any data that involves the car being able to better avoid a human, we can make the argument that it should be data that should be made public so that all the manufacturers could benefit from this. But of course, this view is not going to be shared by manufacturers such as Tesla that have an edge on this race, and they have the lead in terms of the data collection. They would like to keep this data proprietary. So this is going to be something that I think our decision makers, especially our policymakers, will have to decide what are the benefits, what are the trade-offs. Do we want to incentivize the companies to collect this data and also keep it public and keep it private for themselves? Should we have some restrictions on how it has to be made public? And what are the benefits in terms of being pro company and letting the company that collects more data have an advantage and benefits from the data that it collects versus sharing the data for everyone so that everyone can better avoid crashes. And then finally, I think a big problem that we'll have to solve from our I would say government side is how, as manufacturers approach autonomy, how are we going to test the systems, the very complex systems that they have, and how can we make sure that they get tested on all the relevant edge cases? Because a lot of these example-based systems, they work very well as long as they're in the situation where they're seen examples for. The tricky part is when they get put in a situation where they've never seen examples of. So that's a little bit of the overview of the ideas I wanted to put in terms of policy implications. I think this is my final slide. It's about infrastructure support. There's an obvious benefit to in an obvious way in which the infrastructure can help the AV cars, and that is to have more communication. Other speakers have already talked about this. I know that we're going to see a lot of discussion about this in the part 2 of the series, but I wanted to also draw attention that the infrastructure can help by facilitating communications between the road users and the cars, but also, and I think this is a very relevant point that's becoming more and more relevant, is that the infrastructure can really help the autonomous vehicles by removing ambiguous situations. So the hardest situations for the car, and I think we've already heard a little bit about this from Justin, is just that any situation in which it's not obvious or in which there are informal rules of the road that the car cannot easily learn. For example, the habit of having cars, the flow of traffic go above the speed limit. That's going to be a challenge for any autonomous vehicle. Should it keep with the flow for safety, or should it respect the maximum speed? We still have kind of in our road guides, we still have a lot of rules of the road that can be considered somewhat ambiguous. For example, four-way stops where multiple cars arrive at the same time. This can become particularly tricky for an autonomous vehicle to decide, especially if you cannot communicate with the other cars, who goes first. Right now we have, people waving at each other, nodding at each other, but this is probably something that the autonomous vehicle will not be able to see. And there will not be, will not be able to take those cues. And also, I think a very relevant one for any type of decision makers that have decision-making power about pedestrian paths. Right now, there's specific, I guess we all probably know in the areas that we travel on, that there are certain areas where informally sometimes we see jaywalking, for example. And we kind of, as we approach those areas, we already kind of expect to see it there. We know that there's no yield to pedestrians there, there's no zebra crossing, but we know that sometimes we see pedestrians there. Those situations where there's this informal, anything that's culturally expected, it's going to be very hard for autonomous vehicles. And finally, disregarded rules of the road. So here in the U.S., sometimes there's a culture in certain parts of the country where there's, not always the cars yield to the pedestrians, and sometimes even the pedestrians themselves do not expect to see the yield. This is getting better, but it's still the case. Well, an autonomous vehicle is always going to yield. So for a pedestrian, especially if the autonomous vehicle is not marked very specifically as autonomous, it might be, an unexpected situation, and so it might be cause for somewhat of a dangerous road condition. So that's really all that I wanted to say. I guess there's before I finish, I guess we can leave questions for later. So I just wanted to leave here just a brief message about our intelligent mobility meter that tracks pedestrians and cars and can count pedestrians, bicycles, and cyclists. This is just a project ongoing here at CMU, a funded project where we're collecting fine-grained statistics on pedestrians, cyclists, and vehicle traffic. There's two parts of it. There's a hardware platform, and there's data analysis done here at CMU. And our hardware platform is loaned to organizations. In this case, it was loaned to City of Pittsburgh. And I just want to point it out that this for data collection is free for government and qualified nonprofit organizations. So, for example, for any bike organizations that might be listening, or municipalities or cities, if you have the need to do data collection and count or see the paths or the wait times for pedestrians and cyclists, there's this infrastructure here at CMU, and you can get in touch with me, bpars@cmu.edu, to learn more and possibly even to get some data collection systems and some countings done if that's something that you require. So I just want to put this out there since I have numbers of people on the line. And I guess this is all I had to say. We'll save the questions for later. I'll be happy to discuss in the panel.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And do you want? Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll take the screen and hand it right over to Michael. That was great. And as I'm transitioning over, those technology issues we had faced earlier put us back a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and let everybody know some of our panelists have agreed to stick around a little bit beyond our original end time. I understand if you all can't, we do want to take some of that time and answer questions. So I wanted to let you know that we do plan to do some of that. So Michael, if you get set up with your presentation, let me know if you see that alert and if you can send your screen to full screen mode.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Mike Jenkins. I work for a company called Charles River Analytics located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm actually going to be talking today about a US DOT Federal Highways Administrative funded SBIR effort that is a small business innovation research effort that's actually focused on developing the technology to bring bicycles onto these connected vehicle networks that the prior panelists have been talking about. So you can go ahead to the next slide, Dan. So we've already seen the figures. I'll try and make up some time for everyone, but the point that I wanted to make here is there's different levels of vehicle automation that are coming. And really, I think what's important are 2 points. One is that Justin called out earlier is that, as the levels increase in the deployment timelines to get the stuff into the environment is sort of getting prolonged or is going to be further out. So, level 5 automation is going to be a long way out, but we need to start thinking about what's going to happen when that's the case. And this is the stuff that the DOT is really interested in, really starting to invest resources into to plan for that level of automation so that when it comes, we're more prepared for it. So that's one of the areas where this effort is coming from. And then the other thing that Bernardo touched on that I thought was great is the idea of situation awareness. And really this automation, the idea is that you're providing more situation through automated capabilities on these vehicles, but it's important that that situation awareness is a shared situation awareness. So when you talk about all the shared user of the transportation environment that are out there, it's not just knowing where people are and knowing what people are sort of currently doing in a given state. Really, this technology is requiring a shift in the mental models, the shared mental models for how people understand transportation in the world. So we talked about, I think Justin showed the slide where there's a lot of literature where you're supposed to make eye contact before you cross the street or make sure that they see things. And these are the mental models where you know if you see that car, that driver, that they've recognized you, so you have a behavior that you anticipate they will follow. In the future, you can imagine you know, you look at a car, and because you're hard to detect, you might have to carry out a calibration maneuver. So I have to stand there with my arms fully out to the side in a T shape, and then the car lights up and says, okay, I can see you, so go ahead. So it's thinking through sort of how do our current mental models shift as this automation comes forward that we're really going to need to start to consider. So you can go to the next slide. And Bernardo touched on this too. Hopefully people can see this video and it should sort of just replay itself. But for those people who ride bikes or live in an urban city, I'm sure folks have seen this sort of maneuver. It's just to stop you when you're waiting at a light to sort of progress. And what I wanted to point out here, and Bernardo touched on this, is it's extremely difficult to detect bicycles. In the use case that you're seeing here, this was something that was done when they were testing Google's autonomous vehicles that just drove the Google cars crazy. So someone would sit at a stoplight like this, and the Google car would basically, every time the bike started rolling backward or stopped, the car would start to progress into the intersection. And then as soon as the bike started rolling forward, the car would slam on its brakes. So the car basically was, sputtering through the intersection trying to figure out what this bike was doing. So this is the type of edge cases that make bikes so hard. And really, what a lot of research is, and this is, Bernardo pointed this out, bikes are the hardest use case for sort of shared transportation users, just because they're so light, they're so quick, they don't have a lot of mass to them, they're very swervy, and then people load them differently, so they have different images. So when you talk about the machine learning that was discussed earlier, there's so many example cases that have to be studied for a vision-based system to be able to detect this. And I just want to call out that some of the statistics here. So the DeepBox 3D, which is one of these machine learning sort of object identification and orientation systems, that's among the best. So it achieves about 88% of cars being able to identify and orient them. In testing it on bikes, it only scores about 59%. So just over half of bikes will be detected and oriented with some of the best software that's out there, and that's the idea where why these vision-based systems are doing so bad. So this, in terms of situation awareness, for a car and for these vision-based systems, bikes are the hardest thing for them to become aware of and sort of understand what they're doing. And that's one of the things that we're looking to solve. So I'm just quickly talking about for bicyclists specifically, which is where our focus is, traditional approaches. So there's sort of three thrusts here. The first is, technology has been focusing on developing personal protective equipment. So better helmets, better equipment so that, when there's inevitably a crash, the cyclist survives and with minimal harm. Obviously, this isn't the future that we want to think about, but money is going to go into this because crashes sort of have been inevitable to this point. So they say, instead of avoiding them, let's focus on just keeping the person alive. The second two then, so making the cyclist more salient and promoting more heads-up riding, those are focused on helping the humans to make things more salient. So making the cyclist more salient, providing lights, providing loud noises, anything they can so that a driver can see them. The idea there is that then the driver will locate them and they can take appropriate action. So you can think about how in the future, these lights and sounds likely won't benefit an autonomous vehicle unless the programmers of that vehicle take that into consideration. So you could think about maybe bikes have to, have some visual marker on them for these vision-based systems to detect them, but then that's a whole nother set of edge cases and use cases that need to be developed, tested, and sort of vetted for the environment. The third one is technology that now you're looking at, okay, can we help the cyclist have a better idea of what's around them so that they can ride safer? So placing the burden on the cyclist to say, okay, these cars aren't going to notice you, and unfortunately, a lot of the time, this is how cyclists in dense environments operate, just to protect themselves. So let's try and give you the tools so that you're more aware of what's going on and you can make safer riding decisions. And I think the downfall of these is that these can only take safety so far, especially as we look at autonomous vehicles coming where you're actually looking to take the human out of the loop more and more. So with AVs, if you're taking the driver out of the case, then these lights and sounds, as I mentioned, aren't going to help you. And the same thing for a cyclist, they're going to have a shifted mental model of how these vehicles are going to behave, which is something that for current riders and probably the next decade of riders, they're not going to be brought up learning that behavior. So that's a major shift that this technology is sort of going to fail folks on. So you can go to the next slide. So what we're working on is Main Street. So it's an acronym, Multimodal Alerting Interface with Network Short-Range Transmission, because the government loves acronyms. But what we're focused on, as I mentioned, is this DOT effort where what we're doing is developing the technology to bring these bicycles onto the connected vehicle network. Just so everyone sort of knows where we're at, right now we're 4 months into a 24-month effort. So what I'm presenting here is sort of where we're at in terms of our prototype development, and then a little bit about where we're headed. The approach we're taking, we sort of have two objectives. The first is just to build the technology for bicycles that will allow them to connect to these networks. So V2X is a vehicle to whatever network. It can be vehicle to vehicle, it can be vehicle to infrastructure. And the approach that we're taking is highlighted in the center here, where first we're upgrading sort of the tech on the bike that will enable this stuff. Second, we're figuring out how to broadcast that safety message. So a BSM is a basic safety message, and BSMB is basically the standard for bicycles that we're defining as we go along, because that doesn't exist yet. Third is how do we receive and parse these messages from other connected entities. Fourth is how do we use that data to then predict hazards for the cyclist, and then how do we warn the cyclist in an intuitive manner, bring back to what Justin called out, some of the human factor psychology for how do we do this in an efficient way where you're not going to add to the danger of a potentially developing hazardous situation. The second thing that we're looking at is looking at automated cycling assistance systems. So a lot of you may have heard of ADAS systems, which are automated driving systems. So we're thinking about this and we're saying, okay, it's going to be a long time before connected vehicle networks are out there. And I think it was Justin that showed that chart where we're 20 years out for this being a thing. So what we want to do is say, okay, if we're putting this technology on the bike to enable a lot of this, can we actually take the capabilities that are being developed for cars and bring them to the bicycles? Because as I said, as Bernardo said, it's really hard to detect bikes with these systems. So if we put it on the bike has a pretty easy time detecting all the cars around it. So take advantage of the strength of the system, bring it to the end user who's most vulnerable, and provide them with some of the benefits. So that's sort of where we're focused, with the ACAS being a shorter term solution to start to provide technology-based methods to promote safer riding. So you can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we are focused on developing technology here. So this is actual stuff that we're building. We're teamed with a company called VRU Bikes, and the bikes you see on the bottom are our two prototype platforms that were being built out. And then this list here is sort of everything that we're putting onto these bikes. And we're designing it in a way, and VRU is doing a fantastic job of making it an elegant solution so that it's something eventually people would actually want to ride. So the core of this is going to be a Jetson TX2 graphics processing board. So for folks are familiar with computer vision sort of technology, this is sort of a very powerful, very small board. It's about the size of a credit card, but it runs the same architecture as the NVIDIA's Drive PX2, which is the same architecture that is running connected vehicle or automated vehicles like the Tesla. So it's not as powerful, but it has the ability to do a lot of the same capabilities, which is really exciting for us. So what we've done beyond that is then start to put the technology in place on the bike to enable this sort of thing. So we have accelerometers, we have forward and rear facing LiDAR cameras, forward and rear facing dynamic range cameras. We are putting stuff on the bike for alerting, so we have haptic handlebar grips that can alert to them. We actually have a CAN port, so these are e-bikes. Just thinking through sort of what is our full use case. So they're e-bikes that we can get actual data on the computer, on the bike, on the power systems, on the gear and everything that's going on. And then all these other things that you sort of see called out here, and just down at the bottom, pointing out there's data logging and a real-time API so we can access data on these bikes. And they actually have cellular connectivity too. So we're building these for us to be a research platform so we can explore this technology with the idea eventually being that these can be released to the wild, with the overall cost for this bike being around $5,000. So where we see this going first will be city deployments with sort of bicycle share programs to start getting them out there and collecting data, and I'll talk to that a little bit in some of the subsequent slides. But I just want to point out that step one is let's see what we can do on a bike feasibly with technology, and then step two is going to be reducing that platform down to what's essential to provide the benefits. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Dan. So what you see here, and this is talking to that ACAS, I'm actually talking to that secondary objective first. What you're looking at, this is the TX2 running YOLO, which is a you only look once. This is one of the open source detection frameworks object detection frameworks that's out there. So this isn't something the rider would ever see. It's just showing what's going on in the background. And this is actually deployed on a motorcycle right now, just that it was sort of safer to collect the data. But the system on the motorcycle is the same that's going to be deployed on the bike. And you can see it performs pretty well, and this is using a little bit of a modified code on our end where we've been training it. Bernardo talked to the problem of annotating all these images, so what we've actually done is we have an automated annotator that will go through large databases of images and then reduce the manual labor that's required to train the image, to train it. You can actually see on the right there, there's a bicycle with a person on it, and it's struggling to figure out, is it a bicycle, is it a person? It's actually detecting both of them. And even the front of the motorcycle is being detected, and it thinks that's a car. So there's obviously a lot of work that can be done, but what we want to call out here is that this is sort of the sort of technology that we're working on as a short-term solution to bring some of these capabilities to the cyclists themselves. So obviously, we're not going to be implementing things like automatic braking where we stop the cyclist and throw them over the handlebars. But what we will talk about in some subsequent slides is how we can use this information to provide more information to increase their situation awareness so that they are better equipped to sort of respond to the riding environment as it's evolving. So there are functions there I call out, and these are ones that people are pretty familiar with, so collision warnings, lane drift stuff. We do talk about signage detection, so Bernardo touched on that, and I'll show some slides on that in the next one. And then using signage detection for us is actually we're applying it for GPS denied localization, which is really important so that we can take advantage of city map data. And then just at the bottom here, what I do want to call out is that we do view this as a short-term solution because, you know, in capital letters at the bottom there, the burden is still on the cyclist to survive. So just because we're detecting all this stuff doesn't mean that the cyclist will be able to process it and make the right riding decision. So basically what we're doing is giving the cyclist more information to hopefully make a better decision. And a lot of effort is going to have to go into how to present that from a human factor standpoint so that they are best equipped to make those decisions in short response times. But that, you know, we're not automating the problem. We're not taking advantage of any sort of automation that's going to allow them to make faster decisions by being supported by automated capabilities. So you're left with a situation where we're sort of have the same drawbacks of the vision-based solutions that Bernardo was talking about. So you can go to the next slide, Dan. So I quickly wanted to show this, and this is another thing that we're looking into. This is actually using signage detection. So it comes up really quick, but in the top left of this image, you'll see sign names pop up and some characters being detected. And then the blue stuff you see in the map is our running estimate of where the bike is located. So you can see it sort of stays center. And then as they move, it branches off in different directions, and those are probability-based estimates of where the bike is located, with the centroid, that sort of hotspot being this is the most probable area. And then what's happening is when a GPS signal is locked, we're able to reaffirm the signal and say, okay, we're 100% sure this is where you're at. So this is something that for two reasons, and this is sped up, obviously. We're not, you know, gunning it through downtown Cambridge this fast. This is important for two reasons. One is we've experienced that in a city, in an urban environment, GPS has a lot of issues a lot of the time. So especially for a bicycle that's not going to have an automotive-grade GPS sensor on it necessarily, we need ways to basically help localize where the bike is. And the reason for doing that is so that we can take into account context of where they are. So we want to be able to understand that map information that was talked about earlier, I think by Justin, to say, okay, you're on a one-way street, so we don't expect anyone to be coming directly at you. If someone starts coming directly at you, you're probably not expecting it, so that's a really serious condition. And at the same time, being able to detect non-collision-based hazards, so things like railroad tracks, construction sign for groove pavement, shoulder work, just being able to detect those things automatically, so in case the cyclist misses them, we have an awareness of them. And then also what we're using that for is to push it up to a higher level database. So the first cyclist through is sort of our guinea pig that has to source everything, and then subsequent folks can be alerted to it. So you can go on to the next slide. So the real focus of our effort, and I'll be able to go through some of this pretty quick because we talked about it, is bringing bikes onto these short connected networks. So DSRC, or Dedicated Short Range Communications, is the technology that the DOT is sort of is backing at this point. So I don't think they officially endorse it, but I think it's sort of the technology that is winning out, and the SAE standard that is promoting it. So right now, this is the wireless communication technology designed for safety applications and communication between different vehicle and infrastructure devices. And really the benefit is it's going beyond just promoting awareness, it's trying to automate it. So this is how we think we can overcome some of the vision-based automated vehicle problems. So it's very low latency, it's useful in high vehicle environments, so you can be broadcasting The standard requires, I believe, 10 times a second, so it's very quick broadcast, and it's immune to extreme weather conditions. So it's not based on vision-based sensors, so as long as the signal is getting through and you can use infrastructure-based repeaters to make sure that you're getting that, you'll be able to tell where things are and send a lot of information to one another in a very detailed sort of these message sets that I talked about. So what we're focused on is, because this SAE standard doesn't address bicycles beyond just saying messages where there's a bike lane here, we wanted to start building the technology so that when these networks get rolled out, bicycles can be considered, because it's fantastic that vehicles are starting to take advantage of this technology and infrastructure as well, but some of the vulnerable users, such as cyclists, are the folks who arguably need this the most, especially because with current AV technology, they are the hardest to detect. So thinking through how we can make that problem easier is an important one to solve. So you can go to the next slide, Dan. So in terms of actual connectivity, the hardware is sort of, we're not focused on the hardware as much as the software. So commercial off-the-shelf radios are continuing to reduce and swap, so size, weight, and power. So they're getting smaller, they're getting reduced power, they're becoming lighter. So that's something that industry is sort of pushing from a vehicle perspective. So a lot of the vehicle stuff now is, USB powered. It's not much smaller than, say, a couple iPhones stacked on top of each other. And it's becoming a lot easier to get these onto bikes, especially with e-bikes becoming more prolific, especially if we think about what's happening over in Europe, seeing those trends here. So I know there's at least a few ride shares throughout the US that are now deploying e-bikes as well. That'll largely solve our power issue, and other ones can be solved by deploying either small battery packs that have to be recharged, after a couple rides, because these are low power, or just generators on the bikes themselves, like people use to charge their iPhones currently now anyways. So we're focused on the software, and really what we're looking to do is being able to generate what is a safety message for a bike, so helping to define what that standard is so we know what's being broadcast out, and then being able to source that information when you're on a bike. So a bike, unlike a car, doesn't have a full computer system that's monitoring all its systems at once, and then being able to source that and broadcast it. And then also taking into consideration, how do we actually identify hazards for a cyclist, because they're such a unique class of transportation user, where they're using different positions in a lane similar to a motorcycle, but also have the ability to sort of leave the road at any time and go onto a sidewalk. They have dedicated lanes, and they have different types of behaviors than you'll see with other transportation users. So starting to model those behaviors and be able to use that information in conjunction with what we do know about cars to be able to detect hazardous situations. So you can go to the next slide, Dan. So we're sort of looking at this at a tiered approach, and the first tier is arguably the most important, and what that's focused on is just getting the state information about the bicycle out into the environment. So the cyclist doesn't even necessarily know it's there, but we're broadcasting information on you so that other vehicles can use their advanced multi-million-dollar capabilities to avoid you. And there's two modes that we're exploring in our effort. The first is our bare bones version, where you just have a radio and a GPS. And you can't source much from that, but you can source some pretty critical elements. So position, heading, and velocity obviously are things that are pretty easy to get from GPS. So being able to take that, translate it into the format that these other messages or these other receivers need, and then broadcasting it out so that they know your location, and doing that at a frequency that's required for the standard. And then mode 2 is using our tech equip package. So what can we do if we have a bike that has more sensors built into it? So all the mode 1 GPS stuff, but then adding IMUs, mechanical sensors, and a more precise GPS system. This is allowing us to get these additional data elements, so things like acceleration, braking status, lane position, power and gear stuff, turn state. There actually is the ability to turn signal, so that with the bike we're building, the rider has the ability to input when they're signaling, or you could put an IMU on a rider using the rider's like a smartwatch or something like that. And then just general bicycle state system, so whether the bike could actually broadcast out if the if their radio isn't working for receiving messages, so that the other vehicles know sort of what's going on with the bike. So providing a more robust messages, so cars and other vehicles and infrastructure have more information to operate. But at the bottom there, just calling out, really this is tier 1 is letting everyone else know what you're doing, so that they can they have the burden of sort of responding to you appropriately. You can go to the second slide, or next slide, Dan. So tier 2 is then focused on hazard detection. So really, we can turn these radios on, and we can receive all these messages coming in from the environment. There's 10 times a second from every vehicle and every other connected entity in the environment is a lot. So it's only valuable if you can do something useful for them, for the cyclists. So that's what we're focused on. So what we did is we actually used the pedestrian bicycle crash analysis toolkit as a starting point to identify our vehicle-related crash scenarios. So some of them are highlighted here from that PBCAT tool. And then we've also identified a set of infrastructure-related crashes. And what those are, you can think of those as, what we're looking at historical data for bicycle crashes and looking at features of like an intersection that typically lead to an accident. Or we're looking at things just like how do you alert a cyclist effectively if their current glide path is going to put them at the light right when it turns yellow or red, and they're going to be in a situation where they either need to stop quickly or they're going to run the light when there may be a car coming. So coming up with the scenarios that we think based on these message sets we can actually detect. Using that and then modifying road laws and road design information. So what do we know about the road itself? What do we know about the lanes of travel and directions and rights of way to start building some basic alerting scenarios, and then assembling a picture of what's going on in the overall operating environment and having a sort of a real-time playback of that. So there's messages for those of folks who aren't familiar that are coming just from infrastructures that deal with signal phase and timing for intersections, but then also that deal with map information. So this helps to overcome that reliance on traditional map data like Google Maps, where the city can actually put out a beacon that's broadcasting all of the detailed parameters about how the road is designed, what an intersection is sort of structured as, what capabilities are there, how are things built, and that's something that's a lot easier for the city to keep up to date as things like construction go on, as things like updates to the actual signal timing goes on, so that as you approach that, you're getting the most up-to-date information to know what you're sort of getting into. So our goal here is to really build a picture, build that running estimate of what is our automated situation awareness, and then extracting from that, how do we tell when hazards are developing so we can appropriately start to alert the cyclist to those capabilities. So you can go to the next slide, Dan. So in terms of alerting, what we're looking at right now is we're sort of taking a kitchen sink approach, and we're doing a multimodal approach. And the idea here is that these will need to be validated. So I want to caveat this by saying that we haven't tested these yet. We're just building the technology to support it. So the first, for visuals, we're working with a company called Smart Halo. On the lower left there, you can see their device is basically a ring that attaches to the handlebars. It's got a 30 LED array, and then it has a speaker built in it too, and it's RGB, so you can do any color you want. So we're coming up with visuals that help to alert to different hazards as they're developing. Second, we're dealing with audio that actually comes through that as well. And then third, we're dealing with haptics. So on the right there, you can see these little grips that go into the handlebars, and they can do a full range of different signals through vibrations in the left and right handlebars. So you have the ability to do some localization as well. So the idea here is learning from what we've seen in other domains. Display-free warnings are stuff where the user doesn't have to interpret stuff, should result in shorter reaction times. And looking at accessories that could be retrofitted to existing bicycles. And what we want to do is then we're coming up with a plan to validate these, which we'll talk about in some of the later slides. But this is where we're really starting to take advantage of the DSRC from the cyclist perspective, where we can actually collect the information and then start to provide the highest priority information back to the cyclist so they are better equipped to act. So you can go to the next slide. And this is sort of looking at how do we actually do that effectively. So what we have now, or what we're looking into testing, is five general hazard categories. You can see those on the left, ranging from imminent hazards to just things that you might want to avoid. They're not necessarily dangerous, but hey, heads up, there's a pothole ahead, things like that. So you can look at this as an example, and across the top you see for this imminent hazard, the alert type. So it's a very rapid and high frequency alert. It's the loudest among these, and they take into account the environment. So the intensities are above the mean threshold. So that's basically above what's the ambient noise in the environment. And it's going to be a quick onset and directional if possible. So we want to, quickly play a tone that's going to get you to look in the right direction so you can see what the hazard is and react as quickly as possible. And what we're planning on doing is we've sourced these from existing research in other domains, so looking at in-car alerts and in-cockpit alerts from the aviation industry to come up with these standards. And now we need to go through some actual validation to see if these are eliciting the responses that we want in terms of reaction time, salient to the rider, and whether or not it's actually contributing to the hazard by distracting them from what they should be doing at the time. So you can go to the next slide, where we talk about actually testing this stuff. So Justin showed their pedestrian simulator. This is our bicycle simulator. So the idea here, and I don't know how it looks to you guys, it might be a little choppy, but like Justin said, it's pretty smooth when you're running it in your lab. So we've outfitted a bike to basically allow you to ride around in a virtual environment. And this mixed reality simulation allows us to do two things. So the first thing it's going to let us do is actually simulate different hazard scenarios and then test our alerting protocol. So you can see on the bike there's a smartphone where we can do some visual alerts, and then we're actually putting that smart halo into the sim as well. But then we can also play alerts in the real world, and we can actually vibrate the handlebars of the bike that you're riding to actually see how people respond to the haptics in response to what's going on in the virtual environment. The other thing we can do, and the other thing we're working on, is actually building an arena where we can test the DSRC communications under real operating conditions to see how cyclists respond, to start to understand how to really generate these hazard scenarios. So what we're doing here is we're going to be collecting DSRC messages from infrastructure and from vehicles traveling around a real world environment, and we'll talk about on the next slide, we're looking at Las Vegas, where we take that data and we can actually feed it into our simulator that will be a representation of Las Vegas to then control the flow of traffic in the simulator. So we can basically say, okay, let's collect data over a 8-hour time period in Vegas and use that as an input, so then we can then basically play it back and ride a cyclist. So cyclists can then ride through the environment to experience it, and we can be broadcasting the DSRC messages to see how, one, how that changes how cars would respond if they were autonomous at different levels, and two, to see how a cyclist respond if we were giving them alerts based on the algorithms we're developing. So as the cyclist in the simulator is approaching an intersection, if a car is on path to hit them, we can use the DSRC messages in the simulated environment to generate an alert for them that would follow the timing they'd see in the real world, to make sure they're getting that alert in sort of at an ideal time for them to respond without it turning into a collision or a potential near collision even. So that's what we're using the VR for, just as a way to sort of build this out and test these types of technologies in a more controlled environment. You can go to the next slide, Dan. So the path forward then is to deploy this in the real world to start doing some controlled testing. So Las Vegas is really invested in the idea of a smart city infrastructure. So I'm not sure if folks are on the phone from Vegas or if they've seen sort of what they're working on, but this is their planned DSRC installation location map. So basically what they're looking to do is before the end of the year, I think they're going to have around 60 total roadside units deployed on all of these infrastructures in their downtown area. And the colors just indicate their deployment phases. And the idea is that they're going to be broadcasting all the signal phase stuff, all the map information, and they're also putting onboard units on city fleet vehicles, so buses, emergency vehicles, things like that. We'll have them on those items so that we can then take our bikes, deploy them in this environment, and actually start riding around in a controlled fashion to see what kind of data we're getting. So we're obviously not at the point where we want to be putting people in hazardous scenarios to see what happens, but this will allow us to ride in controlled scenarios and see if we're getting information at the right time, if we have any false alarms or if anything is coming up, and we can actually look at data in a sort of in a more ecological setting. So the plan is to move forward as early as October to get these bikes out in the environment, and then start to iterate on what you find based on that. And you can go to the last slide, Dan. And then for more information, you can feel free to reach out to me. Our DOT contact, for those of you in the DOT or government, is Jeremy Raw. He's at in the DOT's planning office in DC. And I will call out that we are looking for other test cities. So if there's folks that are interested in getting this technology into their environments, we're definitely open to collaborating with getting some of these bikes deployed and helping us to collect data and bring bikes onto these networks. So I think that's it for me, and we can move to questions if there's still time.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And we are going to get into some questions. I think maybe a limited discussion given the time we have remaining. We are going to continue on here with our overtime period. And I appreciate all the panelists and all the attendees sticking with us. I want to flash this slide up while you're waiting. Some things you might want to be aware of on this topic to think about coming up. But as we get into the Q&A, one topic that seems to be coming up over and over again, I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody here. In fact, I think Justin maybe mentioned a little bit of it in your presentation. So Justin, if you could start this off for us and respond. A lot of questions, especially with respect to V2X, or vehicle to pedestrian, vehicle to bicyclist. questions about equity concerns. Specifically, you're thinking if you're sending these signals to folks on their smartphones, people kind of making the assumption that folks are going to have those phones on them. Could we be thinking about maybe equity considerations, or possibly people who can't afford those phones or can't afford that technology? Are they maybe at more risk in a world like this where that's what's needed to avoid a crash? If you can weigh in on that issue.
Sure. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. In fact, I was wondering through Michael's talk how much both all that weighs, but everything goes down in price eventually. But especially as these types of advanced technologies are coming to market, they're not going to be cheap. And if like you said, everybody has a smartphone, but that's not necessarily true. The last figures I looked at, I think they're from a year ago or so, were pretty high, but it's still only something like 2/3 to 3/4 of people have cell phones, have smartphones, and of course that is likely to be especially underrepresented among communities at risk, both economically disadvantaged as well as children are less likely to have smartphones, as well as potentially people such as seniors who may not be as comfortable with advanced technology. So I think it's really important to have complementary technologies that both take advantage of the connectivity that's available out there and that is going to be being developed, but that do not solely rely on it. And I don't think I have a good answer. I would love to hear from other people on the panel, but I'm not sure where that balance lies between taking full advantage of technology while not, it sort of intrinsically provides inherent safety benefits to people who are able to get that technology. So, and again, I think that also, in addition to equity, which is a huge issue, we also have, like I said, issues of battery drain and forgetfulness and things like that. So I think when we're developing systems like this, we certainly can't rely on that type of communication and connectivity to be ubiquitous.
Great. Yeah, great points. Any, Michael or Bernardo, any other thoughts on the equity topic or consideration? It's sort of a big issue that may not be as well covered as some of these other things. Yeah.
So this is Michael. What I can say is that we're considering that to a degree. So obviously our stuff is not cheap yet, but we're not building it to rely on anything the user is bringing to the bike. So we don't use the user's cell phone at all. That's not a part of our envisioned interface. You saw it in the simulator there because we were using it just as a test because we had a Unity model for it. But who we're actually working with is we're working with rideshare companies. So we're talking with a couple different major U.S. rideshare companies to say, okay, can we work with you guys to get this on your bike so that folks who are using those, with that tier 1 technology, they don't even know it's there. It's just there and it's running. And to just put a radio on the bike, to buy one radio is going to be around like $200. So you can imagine if you're buying 20,000 of them for a fleet of connected bicycles that these companies operate at, that cost is going to go way down. So there's benefits to get them there, and then you can think through some of the major bike manufacturers. I don't know if we have folks on the line from those types of companies, but they have razor-thin profit margins. So that's where there's a question of at what point will they be able to start putting this on their bikes for cyclists as they have it. But in the meantime, it's something that we're passively thinking about. But I don't even think the technology is really there yet where we can start considering, okay, what is an end-user cost going to be to just go out and buy this and put it on my bike?
Yeah, no, good.
I'm sorry if I can just add one thing on it. This is Justin again. So I think your point's really well taken, Michael, that there's likely to be a cost efficiency of scale to things that are built into bikes, but conversely, I could see a market for specifically add-ons. So for people who have kids with a 16 or 20-inch bike, where they could put one of these beacons on, or say a Power Wheel or a scooter or something like that. I have 2 young kids, and I've thought about that a lot. How great would that be, especially since kids are much less skilled at controlling these things, or for people with disabilities who rely on scooters or I don't remember what they're called, rascals, things like that. Having something that's modular as well as an option could be challenging, like we said, from an economic equity standpoint, but in certain ways, it could improve the equity for people with disabilities if the cost issue can be mitigated to some extent. It could improve safety. That they're current. It can improve the situation that they're currently at a safety disadvantage when they're on roadways with these types of things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I have just one more question I wanted to get to before we wrap up. There are a lot of folks on the webinar right now who are representing, maybe they're not coming from the technology side of things, they're not coming from even the city perspective or the state, but they're with advocacy organizations. And so pedestrian advocates, bicyclist advocates, advocates for non-motorized transportation, active transportation. What do you see for the panelists, all of you, what do you see as the role that these organizations can play right now in getting engaged on this topic of technology? Is it to raise these issues among their local agencies and get them thinking about it? Is it to become even more engaged with the technology and find ways to weigh in and provide, engage with the technologies in some way, these vehicles, these bicycles? Do you see an opportunity for advocates to insert themselves into this process?
So this is Mike. I can comment at least as a start and say that I think there's a huge opportunity for the major advocacy groups to talk to their cities and say, hey, this sort of technology is coming. What can you do to protect us? And from an infrastructure perspective, that's stuff that's available now and they can put out there. They can put it on the stoplights. They can put it where there's bike lanes. They can put it on city fleet vehicles, which is really important. So getting it on buses so buses can start to have this technology. And building the technology out there, so pushing cities to invest in this is important so that when the technology starts to become more live and on these different platforms, they're ready for it. So I think that's really the first place to start, is talk to your local government and say, this technology exists, the DOT is funding it, so it already has like funding pots that could potentially be available at the city level. So why don't we have it? Why are we waiting to deploy it when it's something that's ready to hit the market now and it just needs folks to invest in it?
Mm-hmm. Great.
And if I may add also, this is Bernardo on one. I think the advocacy groups, both bikes, pedestrian advocacy, they're often the best ones to that know the most about what in the city requires the most attention. So not only should they push the governments to invest, but they're also often the best equipped to tell the government, on a limited budget, where should things go. So if you only have, enough budget to buy enough radios to equip 10 intersections, make sure the governments choose wisely. What are the intersections that are most dangerous to cyclists? What are the intersections that are more problematic for pedestrians? So I would also add this to Mike's great answer, that it's not only pushing, but it's also helping to direct where the funds go. And nothing is worse than, cities getting funds or equipment from the government, and then just by lack of, maybe they don't have enough people to figure out where it can have the most impact. And I think here the advocacy can really make a difference in making sure that the intersections that need it are the intersections that get it. So that's only what I wanted to add.
Okay, very good. That's probably going to get us toward the end of our period here. I know we've gone even further over than we anticipated, and I appreciate both the panelists and the attendees sticking with us, you all out there taking up this information. Laura, I wanted to see if you wanted to offer any final words on this. I know you've got, you and Justin have the paper coming out in a couple of weeks. We're going to be having our part 2 episode. Any thoughts on maybe transitioning from this episode to the next?
Yes, I think just as you can tell from our great speakers today, this is a fast-moving area. There are so many issues that we want to be talking about and covering. It's not limited just to the technology. I think a lot of the discussion today about the technology helps give rise to some of the greater societal issues that we're going to be discussing. And we're going to cover those a lot more in the second webinar as well. But there's still a lot to discuss around who benefits from these technologies, what the needs are, where the needs are, and then who has the power to make these decisions, and how can we, as all of our collective coming together, how can we influence those decisions to move in the right direction in a way that'll help foster and continue building walkable and bikeable environments. So thank you for sticking with us today, and I encourage you to join us in the discussion when we talk about policies in a couple more weeks. We are also starting to plan a Twitter chat, and if you have thoughts on the key questions that we need to be discussing in the Twitter chat or in future webinars in the series, we would love to hear from you. I know we didn't get to answer even a fourth of the questions that we received, and so we certainly want to keep this conversation moving forward. But thank you to all of our panelists who are very engaged with this issue, as well as the attendees today.
Great. Thank you, Laura, and thanks again to Laura, Justin, Bernardo, and Mike for all the presentations. You're going to be greeted by a brief survey as you leave the webinar today. If you have a few extra minutes and can weigh in on our performance, we would appreciate it. Provide us comments back on what else you'd like to see covered. You'll be receiving a follow-up email later today with all of your archive, certificate of attendance, all that good information, and we hope to see you back here in just a couple of weeks. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you all have a great day.